Hey everybody, Steve here with Cryptic Woodworks. Today I'm standing at the front of my table saw because I think it's time that we start a new project that is of special interest to anyone who's into making puzzles. So I've used a variety of sleds and clamps and miter bars on my table saw, and as you can see right now I've got a pretty, well, extremely basic setup. I take my miter bar, which is one of the Incra miter bars. They're nice and accurate. And just clamp some scrap wood onto the front. I know I could do things by making T-track and sliding it in, but honestly I just find it faster to throw a piece of scrap wood on with some clamps. And then I use this as a sacrificial fence, so I don't have the tear out behind it. However, it can be a little tricky when you're working if you're close to the blade. How do you hold things down? I've used, sticks and pencils and stuff because I don't want to get my hands anywhere in this territory. But overall, because your fingers get tired, most of the things you're holding with can slip a little bit. I've lost some cuts and had to recut some pieces. And that's time consuming and it's wasteful. So I think it's time to put together a new sled that's going to go on here. And it's a type of sled that's made almost especially for puzzle making, for a lot of small part work, very repetitive work, and high accuracy work. So I've already started cutting some of the parts. I'll switch over and I'll show you what that's going to look like. So a while ago I happened across an Instructable on Instructables.com, and then there's a video to go with it of a rather well-known puzzle maker, Lee Krasnow, who developed this puzzle maker sled. I'll put a link to the Instructable. It's really, really worth watching if you want to make a sled like this and going over the Instructable. There's so much good information there. I'll probably try to cover a chunk of what's there as I build mine, but I'll be deviating a little bit so to meet my own needs. So the way these sleds work is that I'll take a few of these off so we can kind of see the base. It's going to have two halves. So these are going to be the sled plates, or the bottoms. And these are both made of two pieces of 1/2-inch plywood. I know you're probably thinking, like, well, that's really heavy for a sled. We're going to lose some blade distance, but generally speaking, at this point, you're cutting puzzle pieces. And I was measuring, and I still have a 2-inch height that I can get off of my 10-inch table saw, so that's plenty for any kind of puzzle work that we're doing. And you want to keep this fairly small because it is going to get kind of heavy. But again, you're doing relatively small work, so we're not putting 24 or 48-inch pieces of plywood on here. And then the front and the back will have these sandwiches that are made from multiple pieces of 1/2-inch plywood. And these will get cut up and spaced here in the center. And then there'll be room for bolts to go down through that will fasten into these pieces as I go along. And then they will form the front and the back, and they'll be what actually holds the sled together. This is currently about 3 inches tall, or 3.5 inches tall. I'm thinking it might be a bit much. I want to make sure I clear the blade, but since my blade's only coming up about 2 inches or so here, I don't know if I need quite this much room over top, because it'll just add weight and get in the way. So for putting the sled on the table saw, Lee has on his using bearings. So these would get mounted at several points along here, much like you would be putting in just a normal slider in the track. And then these would be fastened up from underneath using some 1/4-20 bolts that come into the bottom of the sled plate. So I got a bunch of bearings. But over time, I've also started using what's called these UHMW slides. These are just the ultra-high molecular weight. You can order them from like Lee Valley, Woodcraft, a couple of places you can get them. And these I find slide really, really well in the T-track, in the table saw runners. So I might end up just using these instead because they're going to be a little bit easier to put in. I won't have to worry about getting the bearings just perfect. And maybe if I do another sled at some point in time, I can try out the bearings. I just wasn't certain how easy these were going to be to get in place. So the fun part about making one of these sleds, and I say fun, I mean you're going to be drilling a lot of holes, is we take this plate on each side. We kind of figure out how far we have to come in. We come over a little bit to stay away from the blade, a little bit from the outside edge, and we lay out a grid work. I think Lee had on his about 1.5 inches apart vertically and horizontally. And then we drill holes through, and then in each hole in the center, so we think the hole would go down through this into this bottom piece and out through, we put in some of these T-nuts, and they would get countersunk in down here so that the other plate would go on top. And then this gives you this whole grid work of mounting points that are all over both sides of this. And on that grid work you can do things like make a base for a little toggle clamp like this. So you can make a little wooden base to put that on that lines up with that, and then when you're cutting you drop down your toggle clamp, and that will come up against your back piece or your guide or whatever you're using. And you could get 4, 6, 8, 12 of these toggle clamps. So this way when you start cutting pieces, you've got that clamped in every time you do it. So your hands can be way out here, and you can get a lot of pressure off these, so you know that your parts aren't going to be shifting. You can also mount little hold downs to put in stops along the back. You can do all sorts of stuff with it. In fact, for doing sticks, he actually has some instructions and videos on how to be cutting in this direction, so that you can actually kind of get your sticks to be, if you wanted a perfect 1.5 inch square stick, you could actually get it to the point where it could do that, because you could mount stops in this direction that your sticks go against. So a really, really versatile kind of sled we're going to be building. And then the final part, and I don't have these parts yet, you could either make an auxiliary fence out of wood, or you can get what are called machinist parallel bars. And what they are is you would set your pieces of wood or your parallel bars here, and you get yourself some spacers, and you can do things like feeler guides, so you can get very accurate spacers. You could use the little bits of paper. So you position them off against spacers, and then on each side you put one side on, it would lock into those holes, and then you can do a 2-cut or 4-cut method to figure out, okay, is my cut perfectly square? Now the good thing is when this is sitting away from that with a couple of spacers in here, if you need to, you could take 1 or 2 of your shims off of either side, or you could add 1 or 2 shims to bring that into perfect square. So it's a whole lot easier than trying to come in here and move these fences, and if you move this side too much, so did anything happen over here? So it just makes it a lot easier. So I'm actually going to order in some of the machinist parallel bars. You can find them on places like McMaster-Carr, Amazon, other places. But like I said, you could actually just use blocks of wood too. But I figure if I do it once, I may as well go all the way for it and try to make it really work. So over the next couple of videos, I'm going to show a couple of the steps as I put this whole thing together, and then probably a video or two about how we can use it in order to start making some nice accurate parts. So I hope you follow along and find this useful. Thanks.